Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Today we are talking about negotiation. Donald Trump wrote The Art of the Deal and campaigned on being a master deal maker. Well, how good a deal maker is he? How good are his negotiating skills as president? To answer that question, I turn to David Ross. He is a senior mediator with JAMS, a lecturer in negotiation at Columbia Law School, and an author of a textbook on negotiating skills. David and I walk through some of the basics of negotiation and then apply them to President Trump to try to understand what kind of a deal maker is he really. This is a fascinating conversation, not one I think you're going to hear anywhere else about this president. You're not going to want to miss this episode. I hope you'll enjoy. Thanks. During the 2016 campaign for president, Donald Trump said that what we need in this country is a leader who wrote The Art of the Deal, the book that Donald Trump famously wrote that really launched his celebrity career many years ago. He said in one of the Republican debates, quote, "I'm a negotiator. I've done very well over the years through negotiation. That's what I do is deals. I know deals, I think, better than anybody knows deals," he said. Well, Donald Trump is now president. He holds himself out still as a master negotiator, as a master deal maker. And I thought it would be instructive and interesting and even entertaining to have a real negotiator on Good Law, Bad Law. And for that reason, I've invited David Ross onto the program to talk about negotiation and President Trump's negotiating style. David, thanks very much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to get some background from you, David, so people know what your own background is as a real negotiator and someone actually who teaches negotiation skills and practices them every day. So give us as we get started here today, give us some background on yourself, please.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. I don't know if that's going too far back or not, Aaron.
No, that's probably important.
So for those of you in the Midwest and Ohio, a shout out. I went to law school in New York, to NYU Law School, and then I went to Cravath, Swaine & Moore, a corporate law firm in New York City, where I litigated for a few years, and I realized after a relatively short period of time, although those 3 years felt like longer given the long hours we worked at Cravath, that I wanted to help people resolve problems as opposed to, as an advocate, virtually always prolong those problems, those conflicts. So I went to Columbia Law School. I studied with Professor Maurice Rosenberg, who's since passed. He wrote one of the textbooks on ADR, was a real leader in the field. And I really studied everything that I could at Columbia on negotiation theory, on ADR, which is, as most listeners probably know, alternative dispute resolution, mediation and arbitration, basically. And got an LLM at Columbia, and then went to a firm called Dispute, which was started in Cambridge by some folks who had been at Harvard Law School, and began to focus my career in mediation. Dispute merged with a firm called JAMS, based in California, mainly for judges. And I've been mediating for the last 20 years or so, and I've been teaching negotiation for the past 20 years or so at Columbia Law School.
And so people know ADR, or alternative dispute resolution, has really come into its own and is a central part of litigation. People think of litigation as about lawsuits and fighting all the time, but really the goal in most civil lawsuits is to eventually be in a position to resolve those cases and those disputes. And mediators, through alternative dispute resolution, mediation mainly, but also different kinds of arbitration, has become such a key factor in that. And we, for instance, in my practice, we use mediation quite often. And JAMS, the company that you're now a senior mediator with, is one of the big firms here in Philadelphia that we turn to very often for help in resolving cases. So This is not a peripheral part of the law. This is a very central core part of the law these days. Isn't that right?
I think that's exactly right. And what most lawyers know, but probably most non-lawyers may not know, is that 97%, 98% of all potential or actual litigations end up resolving themselves either through direct negotiation between the lawyers or, if they are unable to resolve it for a whole variety of reasons, through the services of a neutral mediator who comes in and basically facilitates the negotiation process and helps parties resolve litigation and conflict when the lawyers try to, but for a variety of reasons are unable to do so directly. So the short answer is yes, it's been here for a while and it's growing.
And again, I think a lot of people who watch courtroom dramas on TV and see lawyers, involved in, disputing and arguing and fighting and advocating, perhaps don't appreciate what we know from the day-to-day of what we do, that negotiation is a huge part of everything that we do leading up to the courtroom and even in the courtroom, where we're staking out a position, where we're interested in how the other side perceives us and our arguments. We're often negotiating with the court in how we hold ourselves out and hold out our client's position. So I've always thought that negotiation is really a huge part of litigation, of lawyering, in one way or another. And to understand how this president, who again holds himself out and really congratulates himself as being a master negotiator, we have to, I think, start with some first principles. And David, I know from looking at your background, you've written a textbook on negotiation. You have taught lawyers and law students. You are involved at Columbia Law School in teaching the art and skills of negotiation. And with JAMS, you practice negotiation all the time in real cases. So could you give us some of the core principles that anyone, whether in law or in business or in other interactions where negotiation becomes important, what are some of the core basics of negotiation skills that people would want to understand?
Sure. That's a big question, but I will try to break it down.
I'm asking for a whole course in a few minutes. I know.
That's okay. I'm sure everyone has registered and is going to pay the fee. That's a joke. I know that's not going to happen. So I will be simple about it. Negotiation in the end is a communication process. 70% or so of all communication is nonverbal. Most people don't realize that. Lawyers in particular are very focused on the words they use and the tactics and strategies they employ. But in the end, negotiation is very simply a communication process. It's an attempt to persuade, to influence another party or parties to, again, being simple but accurate, to get what they want. So good negotiators go into a negotiation, sit down at the negotiation table, understanding if they're negotiating as a principal, what their interests are, what's important to them, and how they prioritize those interests. And if they're a lawyer representing a client, obviously understanding what their client's interests are, what they want to get at the negotiating table, and being very concrete with the table. A lot of negotiations now take place over Skype, by telephone, by email, et cetera. So I'm using that as a euphemism for simply individuals communicating with each other somehow. So the lawyer needs to know the client's interests, what they want, and what their priorities are, and then they try to advance those interests and meet those interests, again, at the negotiation table. So getting what you want from others is not a bad definition for negotiation.
One of the things I know, David, when I'm talking to my clients throughout a representation, the beginning meeting with a client, as we go along through the life of a lawsuit, as we're getting ready for a mediation or some type of settlement discussion, or as we're getting ready for trial, as many of my cases are prepared for the courtroom. One of the things that I always talk about is the concept of risk. How and you've defined, admittedly, we're talking in the very most ABC way of talking about these things, the basics, but how important is the idea of understanding risk to negotiation?
Hugely important. And as you know, as I'm sure you explained to your clients, there are different types of risks. There are money risk, what the cost would be, for example, to continue to litigate an action as opposed to settling today or soon. Reputational risks. When you litigate, obviously that matter is going public. A lot of the work I do is in the employment discrimination arena and harassment arena. And so, quite obviously, issues involved there are ones that both the would-be plaintiff and would-be defendant often prefer to try to discuss and resolve privately and confidentially. But the short answer to your question is that risk is important, and I'll share an acronym that I rarely say other than in my classroom, but I also use it when I mediate, which is BATNA, B-A-T-N-A. That stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement.
Right.
And you probably know that term, and it's either implicit in your conversations or explicit with your clients. But it really is a hard conversation you have with your clients confidentially before negotiation. Listen, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith, I'll do my best to try to accomplish what you want to accomplish here, but it's important for you to really appreciate what the risks are and what is the best alternative, what is likely to happen if we can't resolve this.
So in a litigation, that could be the risk of going to trial, for example, would be probably one of the more common alternatives to a negotiated resolution, right?
That's right. That's the fundamental one, and then there are risks that relate to that fundamental risk. Because I will often say you're at a fork in the road. You're either going to, through mediation, go down the settlement path and resolve this, and that may or may not happen. It may or may not be in your interest, but you're here. Or the other road is the litigation road, and let's talk about what that looks like.
Now, I think probably most people they may not realize it, but most people have been involved in negotiating something at some point in their lives, whether it's buying a car, buying a house, or negotiating terms of employment, for instance. I mean, many people have had that kind of experience, even if they don't necessarily think of it as negotiation. And I imagine that when people do think about what is the art of negotiation, what is the art of the deal in all of these different contexts, probably what most people think is I should aim high in order to be prepared to come down to some real number. So if I'm selling my car and I want to sell it for $1,000, I should ask $2,000 so that I have some room to negotiate. And I mean, that is a feature of negotiation, to aim high, so to speak. But what are some other considerations that ought to be taken into account in the most basic sense when thinking about negotiation?
Well, first I want to emphasize something you said early on in your question. People negotiate every single day. They negotiate multiple times every day. When it's Saturday night and I want to see Mission Impossible 3 and Laura wants to see another movie, Laura's my wife, a negotiation happens. And we, in our own ways, in our relationship, find a way to persuade the other person to go to the movie that we want to see to get what we want. That usually works out well. Not always, but that's a different conversation. In terms of your observation that when you're buying a used car or any other, or doing any sort of deal that involves money or similar currency, aiming high is something that negotiators need to do. There's research that shows that aiming high, not too high, but high, is a very helpful strategy in claiming more value and doing better with the final deal. A maximum negotiation is that your opening offer, for example, should be optimistic, which means high, specific, so it's understood by the person or persons across the table, and justifiable, that you come in ready to justify, to explain, in a persuasive way, not a heavy-handed way, why your opening offer is reasonable and should be perceived that way. So those are just two quick thoughts on that. And I will be candid, I forgot the end of your question, which was your real question. If you repeat it, I'll try to answer it.
Well, what are some other considerations when thinking about the basic positions you want to take in a negotiation? One is, I think you clarified the idea of aiming high. You have to, first of all, you can't come in too high, or you might find the negotiation over before you've even started.
Yeah, that's rare. People do fear that risk. It's rare that people will walk away from the table unless the offer is so high and so, if you will, to use a non-negotiation term, crazy. Crazy.
Right.
Then someone might walk away from the table, or at least threaten to, because they feel as though you're not there in good faith, and you won't be, that you're, an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about, and therefore there's no reason to have this conversation. It's a waste of time. But usually what happens before a walkaway is a warning of a walkaway, which gives you a chance, frankly, to make a choice whether to reel back on that high initial offer to try to ensure that person stays at the table. So in my experience, the risk of the walkaway, particularly early on, is a bit overstated. My prescriptive thought would be not to be too fearful of that. Be aware it's a risk, but not to overstate it, because it might compromise your ability to make a good, assertive, aggressive opening offer.
Now, David, you brought up the term crazy, and I'm going to jump off on that for a minute.
Good, it's my favorite word.
Yeah, and people might think that I intend immediately to turn back to the subject of Donald Trump.
But maybe.
But no, I want, before we get there, actually, I have something that may give us a better segue into talking about the president and his and what we think of his negotiating style and the success of his negotiations. But I had a lawyer very early in my career say to me, a senior lawyer, and a very successful lawyer, by the way, say to me, in thinking about talking with an adversary and talking about how to present yourself to the other side in a negotiation, he said to me, sometimes it's okay if they think you're a little crazy. And what do you think about that?
I love it. I think it's right. What was your understanding of what he or she meant by that?
Well, it could not necessarily limited to how you position yourself in monetary terms. I mean, a simple negotiation would be, I have like a litigation. It could be I have a car to sell. It doesn't matter really. And you name a price, a starting price that's so high that the person says, that's just crazy. Why would you come up with such a big number like that? But it doesn't have to only mean that. It could be also in the way you conduct yourself in dealing with the other person. You may storm out of the room very dramatically, for effect in the right moment. And things like that the other side might think, oh my God, that guy is just a little off.
Yeah, so let's break that down. Let's deconstruct both those examples so we really understand what crazy means, because there's meaning if you take the time to unpack the word crazy as we're using it in this context. So with the used car and the high demand, let's say, from the owner of the car who's selling it, and let's say, using your example, the owner makes an extremely high demand. The car's worth at most $20,000, and the owner asks for $30,000 or $40,000.
Right.
And let's assume that is a purposeful, intentional tactic, because the best negotiators are deliberate. They're careful, they're prepared, they're planned, and what they do well, sometimes based on intuition and instinct, what they do, particularly with an opening offer, is planned out.
Mm-hmm.
The signal that buyer is trying to send, Aaron, is a signal that is trying to make the person who's going to buy the car perceive the seller's reservation value. In other words, the least amount of money that person will sell the car for. Let's say it's $20,000. Trying to inflate that human being, that person's perception of the seller's reservation value, what often is called his bottom line, his or her bottom line.
Right.
So it is crazy in the sense that it's extreme, or as we would call it in negotiation, it's close to the insult zone. The person feels insulted by it, which, by the way, is sometimes a helpful tactic to insult them, not personally, but with a number. And it's trying to shift their perception of what your bottom line is, and therefore shift the negotiating zone in your direction. Another term that's often used is anchor, to anchor them to your high number, so
Mm-hmm.
they've got to then respond to that, puts them in a defensive posture. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that does lead now to try to apply some of the things we've talked about to the president. And there was, and maybe this is a way to get into this. And I know you have looked at President Trump as a negotiator, and you have some strong views on that, which I'm hoping you'll share with us in the strong way I know you hold them. But I was looking as to get ready for our conversation today, and there was an article in Axios a few months ago that actually talks about Donald Trump as a negotiator, and we've seen him in a lot of circumstances, whether it's the border wall and what he was going to do to get Mexico to pay for it, or dealings with Vladimir Putin, or the North Korean dictator in varying situations, NAFTA, renegotiating NAFTA. So we've seen him at work in a lot of situations. And what's described in this Axios article as his style is to threaten the outrageous, to ratchet up tension, and then amplify that with tweets and taunts. And then ultimately try to, through those tactics, to get the person who he's trying to deal with to what ends up being a fairly conventional middle ground position, that bottom line position. But that what he seems to be gambling on, what he seems to be holding himself out as really being all about, if you will, is that he can stand to be in an uncomfortable place longer than you can. And that becomes, in effect, his crazy in a way.
I agree with everything you've just said. At one point, you used the term middle ground.
Yeah.
And to loop back to your point about the high opening offer for a used car, and some of my comments on that about shifting the bargaining range, by being extreme, by threatening extreme actions, by intimidating, by trying to create the perception, which may be the reality, that he doesn't care about the outcome. He doesn't care if you do a deal. He is effectively trying to shift the bargaining zone in his direction. So he wants what he wants, which is ABC. The other party, whether it's Pelosi and Schumer talking about immigration, or it's a foreign dictator like Kim Jong Il, he's trying to, through his words and his actions, his demeanor and his tone, his craziness, as we've kind of created this umbrella concept, try to shift the bargaining zone in his direction, so that middle ground isn't what it was before he tweeted, taunted, and shared his perspective that he doesn't care what happens here. The middle ground is shifted in his direction, towards his goals, his priorities, his interests. We often hear the phrase, we don't think about it much, for those football fans out there, moving the goalposts.
Yeah.
So midfield is now the 20-yard line. And I won't comment now on his effectiveness. I will just suggest it's important to step back and realize that is what he is attempting to do through the various techniques and tactics you articulated.
Well, what are some of the other negotiating tactics that you see from the president? Again, I mean, he did have some success, at least early in his real estate career and his business career. I think most people look at some of the big deals he did early on, the Trump Tower deal, and there was a big real estate deal involving an old hotel connected to Grand Central Station in New York City. I don't know how much real success he had as a deal maker. A lot of people question his success and wonder whether it's really overinflated. But clearly he had some fairly high stakes dealings as a real estate developer, and that really can't be argued with. But what have you seen observing the president in action as he's tried to get his footing as president? What have you seen and observed about his negotiating style and his negotiating tactics since he's been in office?
Sure. So first, full disclosure, I'm a Democrat. I have voted Republican in the past. I do not like this president. I have real concerns about him. We won't go down that path, but I might as well just be honest about that. I very much respect other people's perspectives on this president and believe in those conversations and healthy dialogue and respect for different political views. Secondly, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, as I mentioned. I live in New York, and I've been here for about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So Trump, I know Trump just from the tabloids and the newspapers, and I'm familiar with him and his a little bit with his career and his life, like we all are to some extent now. I think that the best way to think about Donald Trump as a negotiator is, number one, just to acknowledge the fact that he does have some skills, that he has had some successes. And I think to argue otherwise is, just a little silly and untrue.
Right. That's why I wanted to say that up front too, is I think that's important.
I think it's important. And frankly, he negotiated himself to the presidency. There was a lot of negotiation involved. He had to negotiate with voters of how he messaged. He had to negotiate when he was debating with not just the moderator, but with all the other candidates. And he knocked down, like a bowling alley, whatever it was, 12 of them, whatever the number was, knocked them all down. And he is where he is. So I'm glad that we're agreeing on that, because he definitely has some skills and has had some successes. I think the best way to think about it, or at least one way to think about it, is do the skills, the tactics, and strategies that he used as a real estate developer and self-promoter, how do those translate to the office of the presidency? And I think, without doing a full analysis, because that would take a long time, I think the short answer is not particularly well. If I had to give him a grade for his negotiating to date, it'd probably be, trying to be neutral about it as a teacher, probably be a C minus, maybe a D plus, maybe a solid C. I don't see him in the B range. And the reason, Aaron, is that in a negotiation is all about process. It's all about the communication process. It's about explaining what your positions and interests are, advancing them, and getting as much as you can based on what you have decided you want. But the process leads to outcome. So end of the day, you look at a deal, and you, based on what's been accomplished in that deal, you judge how well you've negotiated. If you look at Trump, just a couple of issues off the top of my head: healthcare. He tried to get that overturned. McCain gave his famous thumbs down, so that's an F. His goal was to get that overturned. He didn't. He had repealed. He didn't. So that is an F. Immigration, probably an F, because there's no outcome there. Nothing has changed. There's been no deal. They've come close, but for a variety of reasons, apparently it just couldn't happen. Building the wall, you mentioned. So that was a campaign promise. He hasn't fulfilled that promise. He's made some tangential and misleading arguments about bolstering the wall. He put up a larger picket fence somewhere or some barbed wire or something. But the short of it is he hasn't built the wall, and Mexico hasn't paid a penny, as far as I know. So that's an F.
Well, hold on. Let's pause on immigration just for a second. Let me push
not
back
my specialty to talk about.
Yeah. And so, and we can talk about this in negotiating terms too, right? In a complex negotiation, this isn't a a straight line when we talk about immigration. So one goal might very well be the border wall itself. You could think of the goal as being some comprehensive immigration reform legislation. That could be another goal. Another goal could be, changing the way we talk about immigration in this country, changing the dynamic, getting people's attention focused on the issue in a particular way. Or another goal might be simply reducing the number of illegals crossing the border. So how do you look at an issue like that, which is very complex, has a lot of moving parts? Perhaps it's not fair to simply say, well, he didn't get any dollars yet for the border wall, so on immigration, it's an F.
That's a fair point, and I appreciate you taking the conversation to a more nuanced level. I was obviously working at a kind of more meta level.
Yeah.
And I also say I really appreciate the fact that you are talking about the negotiation of this big, complex, difficult issue in terms of goals, because at the beginning of our conversation, I tried to be clear about how a negotiator needs to be clear with himself or herself about what his or her goals are, and then, of course, judge success by how fully that person accomplishes those goals through the communication negotiation process. So I think that is very helpful that you're framing it that way. Yes. So on immigration, I think you're suggesting that I graded him too harshly with the F. Is that kind of your bottom line? That's too hard.
Well, I'm not advocating or defending for the president on this issue. I'm just trying to understand when we think of him as a negotiator and what are the skills. Maybe one of the problems in evaluating his negotiating success on immigration, to pick up on your point, is it's really not very clear what his goals are.
Yeah.
And right. I mean, if what people heard during the campaign was, I'm going to build that wall and they're going to pay for it, then yeah, that's probably an F, because it clearly hasn't happened yet. And I think more than one Mexican president said, to hell with you, we're not going to pay any of that.
That's right.
But I think there's more to it. And it's maybe an opportunity to think about negotiation in a very complex deal like this differently.
I agree with you 100%. I think we're agreeing on the building the wall, which was a specific promise, going to build a wall across the whole border. Can't get over that wall, can't get through that wall. Phenomenal thick wall, great wall.
Fantastic wall.
Free wall, fantastic free wall. Who doesn't like that? Everyone likes that. Well, I don't know about that, but that was the promise, the clear promise. So on that, I give him an F. With respect to immigration, you're right, it's more complicated. And I guess, what I would say, and I want to say it in a very kind of neutral way, because I think it would apply to any president. And I'll be simple about it. Immigration is a problem. The left and the right agree that it's a problem. It's in need of a solution that is bipartisan enough that it gets passed by the House and the Senate. It becomes a law and is a solution. Will never be perfect, but is passed into law. So if the ultimate goal, if you will, with a capital U, the ultimate goal is a comprehensive immigration bill that addresses all the problems, immigration law that addresses all or most of the problems that everyone agrees relate to the immigration issue, he has not been able to accomplish that. Now, Obama couldn't, George W. Bush couldn't. So I'm not saying it's not easy. I'm not saying he's a terrible president because he couldn't do that. I'm just saying he hasn't done a deal on that, and he
Right.
and I will also say, and you may remember more than I do about this, as I recall, he came very close. This was 4 or 5 or 6 months ago. Apparently, Schumer and Pelosi, if you're to believe the news, and I still do, were in his office. They were talking about an immigration deal, and they actually were under the impression that they had a deal. This is Pelosi and Schumer. I'm not advocating for them, but that I do believe the news, and they came out and said that they believed there was a deal. I don't think it was a political maneuver or a negotiation tactic. That deal ended up either they misunderstood it or misperceived it, which seems unlikely but possible, or for some reason Trump decided to change his mind about it. There were some theories about that. I'll make a small political point here, Aaron, that you can pick up on and run with or ignore. One of Trump's fundamental goals from day one has been to please his base, to satisfy. And I would just suggest, in a very light way, that one of the primary reasons he has been unable to do other deals on healthcare, immigration, NAFTA, building relationships with allies, other examples, has been because he feels an understandable need. I don't think it's the right priority, but it's a priority for him to maintain his base, because without that, obviously, a lot of the cards in this house of cards fall down.
Well, I think that is an interesting point, and I was thinking about something I think similar to that as we've been talking, which is related to something else I read about his negotiating style. This was in an article in Politico recently, where this a gentleman named Jack O'Donnell, who is a former Trump casino executive, who had some experience negotiating for Donald Trump and actually also watched Trump negotiate a lot of deals. He said this about his negotiating style, quote, "He will say anything to keep people thinking that they're going to wind up doing a deal that's good for them. He gets people to believe, or tries to get people to believe, that they're going to get a really good deal, even though he's obviously only concerned about getting a good deal for himself." People have said versions of that statement in varying ways, some complimentary of Trump and some very much not complimentary of Trump. That he's only interested in himself, his reputation, his image, what's good for him. Many people thought he was running for president very cynically, and who knows, maybe truly, to advance his business interests and not because he so much wanted to be president. But looking again at this from a negotiating perspective, as an evaluation of him as negotiator, what do you think about that as a negotiating style or tactic, that you want to try to persuade somebody, the people that you're hoping will be your supporters or the adversary at the other end of the table, that you are interested in making them a good deal, even though obviously what you're really interested in is making a good deal for yourself?
Well, I'm glad that you raised this issue and shared that quote. The short answer is that if he does that, then that is a very sophisticated and can be a very, very effective and persuasive strategy. To find ways to persuade the person or persons across the table that the deal terms that you're proposing are in fact in that person's interests, and to craft arguments and to advocate and to explain and maybe to charm a bit. He's actually a charming person. To do that is a very sophisticated and very effective way to get good deals for yourself. So if he does that, I've never been in the room where it happened. I have not been in the room with him when he's negotiating, but it sounds like he does that. And if he does, it can be quite effective.
Well, I mean, I haven't either, obviously, but we've observed things that look like some of the things that we've been talking about. I mean, some of the things, for instance, he said to the North Korean dictator Kim Jong Il, promising that a deal with the U.S. would be really good for North Korea, that North Korea would prosper and there'd be business and all kinds of opportunities for them, kind of as an example, it seems, of making, at least striving to make the other person think that a deal is going to be good for them. Other times he's done things that you just say, that just looks crazy. What he did at the European Union meetings this summer, attacking or seeming to attack our friends and allies in Europe, acting like he's going to, start a trade. In fact, starting a trade war with China. If that leads to a better deal someday, well, I guess we'll see. But versions of these things that we've been talking about seem to be the ways he's conducting himself in a variety of different contexts. And so I guess how do you judge those things, or do you think we just have to wait and see?
Well, to some extent, we have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But your example of Kim Jong Il is really quite interesting to me as I'm thinking about it,
Mm-hmm.
because earlier we talked about how the techniques and tactics and strategies that Trump may have used or did use in the private realm when he was building buildings, how that translates to the public realm, or doesn't translate. And again, I'm suggesting it doesn't translate particularly well. Here's a nice example. I think it's hard to make the case that Trump would be as persuasive or is as persuasive when he is turning on his charm in a private conference room, maybe in one of his buildings, with a person who he's read pretty well and gotten to know and created some kind of immediate rapport, even if it's not real, but a sense of rapport, with in a private room, in a private setting, confidentially, one-on-one, shaking his or her hand and whatever he's doing. That, when it's put on a public stage with a dictator from a foreign country and put into all the different news media and heard and read by millions of people, really comes across, I think, as really sort of quite small and silly. I don't want to say idiotic, but just not effective, not effective. So when he's saying, again, with this public loudspeaker, it would be in his interest. It's so good for him. Your country will be more beautiful. You will be even more wonderful and powerful. The sophistry of that just sort of screams at you. So that technique and tactic, while it might be quite effective when he's, building a casino or renovating a condo building, doesn't translate well on the public stage for an American president.
Well, and I guess, I'm wondering how, and again, this isn't by way of, advocating for or against him, but just thinking about some of the things that we've seen and thinking about whether they translate to other contexts where we've seen, you especially have seen negotiations. I'm wondering, in a mediation, for example, where you have adversaries and the mediator at the table at the same time, I can imagine a situation where I, for instance, in the role of representing my client, might speak a certain way to my adversary across the table, but then in a private meeting later with you as the mediator, might speak very differently. All part of the same negotiation, all part of trying to get to my goal in a particular deal. I may conduct myself, speak in a certain way, even use body language. And you made the point of how important nonverbal communication may be. I may conduct myself very differently to different interests in a same who are part of the same deal.
Excellent points. And I would go further and say not just that they may behave differently or speak differently, words used, tone, body language, articulated positions and bottom lines and what they need, but I would say they almost virtually always will. So I'm really just amplifying your good point. And the reason for that, the fundamental reason for that, again, comes back to this idea of perceptions. Adversaries are trying to manipulate with a small m, it's not pejorative, manipulate, influence the perception of the person or persons across the table in terms of how much they need. And they want them to believe, much like Trump does, sometimes quite effectively, that they need more than they actually do. Why? Because if the other party or parties believe that, then to do a deal, they're going to be under the impression or misimpression that they have to give that party more in order to get them to yes, in order for them to say yes to certain terms and conditions of the deal as a whole. So once you go into a private session or what's called a caucus with the mediator, while it doesn't disappear, it dissipates, and the lawyers and their clients feel more comfortable in the confidential setting with a neutral person, myself or one of my colleagues at JAMS, the mediator, sharing what they really want and need, sharing what their real interests are, priorities are, frankly, just getting more to the truth of it. And then that allows me to do my job to find a way to, as you put it, find that middle ground or close to that middle ground that can work for both parties, because my goal is to get the parties to a deal. That's the ultimate litmus test, although I've got to run a fair, neutral process, obviously, and I can do that. But they come in because they want me to help them get to a deal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And you know, we're maybe I'm straining too much here to try to find ways to look at the president and what he does in ways that apply in the other context, in the real world, so to speak, of negotiation, because there are obviously a lot of things that are so confounding about the way he handles himself. I think still to this day, you know, he'll say something or tweet something, and most of us will say, oh my God, no, he didn't just do that or say that. And, you know, a lawyer or a business person in a negotiation in the real world wouldn't probably think that it was okay to say anything, as it's been said about Trump, to say anything, no matter how outrageous, as part of an actual negotiating strategy. I don't think I'd get away with that or get too far with that in my practice. But he does, and that just, you know, we just shake our heads, but and wonder, how does he do that?
So he is an extraordinary, exceptional, intriguing, fascinating, confounding, although interestingly quite consistent in terms of his actions and the language he uses, human being.
Mm-hmm.
I purposely chose a lot of neutral words, and I believe those. I believe he's a fascinating and intriguing person.
Right.
Some of the tools he uses and some of the strategies, some of the language, you're not comfortable using. I wouldn't be comfortable using. Most people are not comfortable using. He is comfortable using, not just in private, but in a hugely public way. Can't be more public than what a president says and does, and in a way that is transcribed. So there is a history, a written history of what he's saying and doing. Most of us are very conscious of that, so we're careful in what we say and do. And we have different codes about you know, how we treat people and the language we use, and that helps society functions in a way that makes it manageable and safe. He does not have those restraints for a whole variety of reasons beyond the scope of our conversation. He doesn't seem to have those restraints. And frankly, put yourself in his shoes. At this point, although things could change.
Yes, right.
He is probably thinking, well, you know, it's worked so far.
Exactly.
I have a beautiful wife. Let's put aside the status of that relationship and the intimacy there. A beautiful wife. It seems that I have $1 billion or more. I'm not sure about that. Let's say he has a lot of money, more than most. I'm president. That's a lot of power. So that's good. So fame, power, money, status, an intelligent, attractive wife. I've got some children. That's important to some people. I've got some kids. I can procreate. So he's probably thinking, well, geez, things are working out pretty good for me so far.
Well, and and particularly to him, although there might be some in his party and Congress who still grumbling over a tweet here or a comment there. You mentioned his base earlier. A lot of those people like the fact that he speaks the way he does, that he's outrageous in some of the ways he's outrageous. He doesn't seem to care that he's going to say what he thinks in the moment he thinks it. And as long as he's pushing for, what people think might be the good of the country, they just don't care. I mean, I wouldn't be able to get away with it in what I do, and you wouldn't either. But there are a lot of people who elected him precisely because they thought that is what he was going to do and the way he would behave. And it's
Yes.
worked for him. You're right. It might
I,
not. Well, let's see how it's working for him in 3 months or a year. But so far,
for him so far, pretty good. So far, pretty good. Um, this idea of whether or not Trump has charisma is linked to the concept of the perception of authenticity. That many people, and I'm not judging or diminishing because I think it's for many people across demographics and socioeconomic lines, they perceive somebody who goes off script or appears to go off script, somebody who shows emotion, which he does, somebody who is unafraid to say words that may not be politically correct.
right.
They process that, they interpret that. And again, I'll go back to the point about body language, tone, energy, nonverbal cues. They interpret that as honesty or as authenticity.
Yeah.
And
Authenticity for sure. Yeah.
yes, authenticity. He is who he is. People will say it's a big defense for him. It's just Trump being Trump.
Right.
We won't go deep on that one, but it seems to be a fail-safe for a lot of people. And voters, average voters, and again, I mean that across party lines and across all lines, average voters do like to vote for people, to support people who they believe they know and who they believe are telling, are being authentic. It's very endearing and attractive to people. And he's good at creating that perception of authenticity. I think in the end, you can make the case it's quite the opposite, and this is one of the greatest shell games and longest running shell games, in the history of the presidency. But when all the walnuts are up, we'll see where the ball is, and every magician's show at some point, comes to an end. But we'll see.
Right, you're right, and that is what we have to see. And we started when we started talking about principles of negotiation and how you formulate an initial offer. One of the things you mentioned, and I have certainly found this in my dealings over the years, is you have to be able to justify your position in some way, even if it's even if you're off making an initial offer that seems very high. You ought to have some rational way of explaining your position. And I think authenticity is really important, but I also think credibility is really important. And that's maybe the clash here we see with President Trump is he certainly is authentic, but at what point in negotiating, whether with a foreign leader or with an ally or with his own supporters, does credibility just undo him? And I think we don't know yet. It's
Phenomenal point. Yeah, phenomenal point. I'm so glad you raised this really important concept of credibility. And we don't know yet. I think you could make the case that over time, he is eroding his credibility with certain constituencies, perhaps not his base yet. But I think in my experience as a mediator and teaching this for 20 years, credibility for a lawyer negotiator or for anyone negotiating for themselves, particularly if they're going to be repeat interactions and as a long-term relationships, see the person again and work with them again. Credibility is the hallmark of the effective negotiator over the long term. And much like a big sugar cube, we'll call that Trump for a moment. If there's enough water that drops on that sugar cube, the sugar cube sort of becomes smaller and smaller and begins to crack and crumble. And I like that metaphor, but I'm not going to go on and on about it. That could be what's happening here.
Yeah. Well, listen, as you said, a fascinating person in Trump, fascinating time we're living in. And this was a fascinating conversation and one that I think is a very different take and perspective on what's going on in the world today. And so thank you, David Ross, for being on the program and helping us understand some of what we're seeing from the perspective you bring. And just thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure as well. Thank you for having me, Aaron. I really appreciated the opportunity. It's a lot of fun.